Welcome back. Well, let's now turn to the topic of food security. Now, according to this year's World Bank Food Security Update for the continent, up to 81 million people in Eastern and Southern Africa continue to experience acute food insecurity as well as famine. It also predicts that number will increase in the coming months for most countries in the region. In the West Africa region, the report says the overall food and nutrition situation is challenging for large shares of the sub-region's population. It expects that the situation will worsen too as the dry season comes to an end. Well, with 60% of the world's remaining arable land, Africa's vast fertile soils represent humanity's best hope for future food security. Now, of course, some argue that boosting medium-scale farming could help to drive agricultural transformation in sub-Saharan Africa. Findings indicate that these farms can be a dynamic driver of agricultural transformation. However, smallholder farms remain the backbone of the sector. They engage over 70% of the population. Well, one of Africa's first commodities exchange platforms, AFEX, is hoping to address this particular issue. In fact, it launched a $100 million 10-year bond, establishing a food security fund that will help to finance the construction of an Agro cities scheme. Now, the scheme will be built on a total of 250,000 hectares of land and are targeted to produce 5 million metric tons of food every year. Well, joining us now with more insight into this is Nathaniel Etim. He's the head and fund manager for AFEX Food Security Fund. Great to have you on the show with us today, Mr. Etim. Now, before we get into this food security fund, I want to get rather your take on this argument that we raised around the fact that medium-scale farming could be that catalyst in Africa's agricultural transformation versus, of course, the reality that in most countries across Africa, the smallholder farmer remains the backbone of the agriculture sector. What's your take? And, of course, where is AFEX in particular throwing its support?
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm really good to be here. So confirm they can hear me clearly?
Very clearly.
All right. Thank you very much. We will continue to provide our support to both the smallholder farmers as well as the mid-sized farmers, which we're now sort of getting into. And so a short answer is going to be both, but it's a longer answer to that, a bit of a longer answer. And what drives that response is really just around two things that guide how we think about our approach to helping Africa feed itself. And that's one, the definition and the dimensions of food security itself, which is around food availability, food access, utilization, and stability. And just at the beginning of this program, you mentioned some of the risks that exist, and all of what that did was just to outline some of the concerns that exist currently in the approach that are being used to solve food security. The second one is then that we also have an objective of shared prosperity, to say that by the time we're done helping Africa to feed itself, there's a concern that we also don't want only a few people to then be happy and live a good life, and then most other people are then suffering. And so there's that mindset of shared prosperity that we have. And so having done a lot of research and engaged a lot of ecosystem players, because we've been in this space for over 8 years now, and studying first in East Africa, coming to Nigeria, and then also expanding to other East African countries. We have seen that whatever solution that would address the issues of food security has to address concerns around resilience, sustainability, but also these approaches need to be market and data-driven and must be ecosystem-led. And so if you're really trying to solve the problem, you must think around these two players. You must think of the smallholder farmers. They have a critical role to play, but also there's a role for the medium-sized farmers to begin to take a greater role in solving some of these problems.
Now, AFEX has actually played quite a big role when you look at what you've been able to achieve. But I want to hone in on this food security fund, because I remember towards the end of 2021 and last year, you were talking about raising as much as $100 million in 10-year debt. How successful was that effort now that we're in 2023? Is it what is now this food security fund? Is that where you're going to channel the funds? And give us a sense of your strategy in dispersing those funds.
Sure. Yes, that is true. That's now the Food Security Fund. And yes, we are in the process of trying to raise $100 million. By the time we had made an announcement, it's because we were committing $5 million of our money as a firm, because we believe in the potential, but we believe that as a firm who has been able to solve a lot of critical problems, was the next step of trying to take an active role to unlock more capital. And so that led to the release of that fund, the commitment of $5 million, yes, but also an engagement with other investors to also unlock their own capital. But for us, the approach was that we'll first use part of our money to then begin to do some pilot projects. So last year, we were able to do about 500 hectares. And I'll explain that shortly. But that the goal as of last year was use our money, get some data points, get the right model to then scale. Yes, we want to land in the agro city, but what's the best approach to go about it? Putting in context some of the things that I mentioned in response to the first question. And so, yes, we still intend to raise the $100 million. We have been engaging a number of investors, and we're still on that journey.
Now let's hone in on something you mentioned, which of course is that Agro Cities scheme, which the Food Security Fund will basically finance. You're looking to do this in key markets such as Nigeria, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, you say Kenya, Rwanda, Uganda, and Tanzania as well. Give us a sense of what that model for these Agro City scheme looks like. What progress has also been made on what seems to be quite an ambitious project?
Sure. Thank you. Truly ambitious indeed. But we don't mind ambitious projects. So what we did last year, in addition to doing the 500 hectare that we did in Nigeria, was to begin to identify the pipeline of individuals and companies that we can invest in. And so we started intense and immersive and personalized training sessions that we have been doing. And so from October up until even as I speak to you today, we have been training smallholder farmers essentially since then. In fact, one of the data that we received in a recent survey is that a number of the farmers who have been farming for over 20 years, for some of them less than 10 years, have never received as intensive training as they have received for the past couple of months. And so that's one part. So the pilot project is one. The second one is then capacity building. But the third part is also case studies that we're writing. And what we're doing with the case studies is to take the lessons that we had earlier on from last year, document all of this, and then engage with a lot of the investors, not just African investors, but also international investors as well. And so leveraging the current structures that we have with the AFEX entities was because when we enter into a country, we have 3 entities that will then provide solutions to smallholder farmers. And so leveraging those entities, what we then do is to identify the smallholder farmers who we think require the empowerment and who are also interested in being empowered and then moving into medium scale farming. So we identify these people, we provide the working capital that they require. We also have a model where we then invest in the farms, and then by the time they increase their yield, they're able to take some of those money and then increase the yield on their own farm, in addition to helping increase the yield on the farms that we had invested in. And the idea is that once that yield is obtained, it will then make sense for processors and other players to then get closer to these locations so as to reduce logistics cost. And so it's not hard to then see that in the next couple of years, what we have then been able to achieve in Nigeria in the past couple of months, we can then do in Kenya and Uganda, because we're already in these 2 countries and we'll be expanding into some of the countries that you just mentioned earlier. And so once we enter into the country, we get the data points and then we build on the work that we have done so far.
And like we did mention, it is an ambitious sounding project. And we talked about earlier how the outlook for food security in Africa right now, prognosis not so great. So I'm curious to know, what then are these funds and the scheme's short-term and also longer-term targets in terms of achieving what it wants to achieve?
Thank you. So just coming from where you started from, which is want to help Africa produce a minimum of 5 billion metric ton every single year, and the hope is to even do more than that. But then sort of working backward, which is that what we then do is to take advantage of other initiatives that we have, other solutions like the ABCP, that these farmers can then leverage, so that the funds from the Food Security Fund itself will then help with things around equipment, around machineries, and other things that will support higher yield. And also mitigate the risk of climate challenges, which we also faced last year. Because we didn't invest in irrigation last year just to pilot some things. And what we saw that unfortunately last year was when Nigeria had some their issues with drought and dry spells. And so we know that anybody who's intending to do large scale projects must do irrigation. And so these funds will then help to manage that. So in the short term, what we're doing is to educate investors to understand that at the minimum, between 5 to 6 years, we need for patient capital, because there must be investment in things around irrigation, things around planters, because without those planters, you don't get the yield that's required, and without the yield, you cannot pay. But also beyond even the production itself, begin to then evolve into processing. And as you evolve into processing, there's more money that even the smallholder farmers and the mid-sized farmers can also make as well. And so we can begin to see results from there. Also, another added layer is then the warehouse infrastructure that we'll put in place. We already have a lot of warehouses across the country in Nigeria. We also do have in Kenya and Uganda as well. And so with the fund, would also increase the number of these infrastructures that are there. And so these are some of the ideas and the solutions that will be seen in the next 2 to 3 years, and then the longer term.
Well, it's certainly an exciting and a unique new model and approach to agriculture in Africa. We'll certainly be watching closely. We do have to leave it there, Nathaniel, but thank you so much for joining us today on the show. That, of course, is Nathaniel Etim. He is the head and